answering the lobby question. We have some great suggestions for trips to take. We appreciate that. Today's presentation is Communication Plan Learning Lab using CCYS results to promote continued survey participation. This is presented by the Southwest Prevention Technology Transfer Center. And here's our disclaimer. This work is supported by awards from the Department of Health and Human Services, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. I'd like to present our two presenters today who come back to be with you, Melissa Adolphson and Kristen Dillon. Melissa is a research scientist and Kristen is a research manager, and they're both from Amherst H. Wilder Foundation. And right now I'll turn it over to Kristen. Kristen?
Thank you, Bev. So today we have a couple of specific learning objectives, and I know any of you that were able to attend the last webinar, we gave some little teasers for today. So hopefully you were getting excited for it. After today, we're hoping that you will be able to identify the components of a communication plan for both promoting the benefits of taking the CCYS and also for sharing the results from the CCYS. And we have some activities today. So today's going to be really interactive. And after the activities, hopefully you will feel prepared to complete a communication plan using the guided process that we share with you. And just a little heads up, we do have a fun knowledge quiz at the end. So it's really important to pay attention as we go through this information. It'll be a fun game for all of you to participate in. So as we talk about a communication plan, there are a few core elements that we really want to ground you in. So the first is framing up your goals. What do you hope to achieve? For instance, are you hoping to raise awareness or build support? We also want you to consider your audiences. Who will be the recipient of the information? Who will deliver the messages? We want you to think about your key messages as they pertain to your audiences. So thinking about the consistent communication, making sure everyone's singing the same song, and identifying the key messages that are either specific to each audience or that cut across multiple audiences. And then we're going to talk a little bit today about choosing the appropriate methods or formats for sharing those key messages, such as developing talking points, infographics, briefs, presentations, comprehensive reports, videos, etc. And I know some of you shared some really great examples during our last webinar. So we're going to be touching on some of those, as well as some additional things that we have used that we found successful. And then finally, your communication plan should include a timeline for when you're hoping to get all of these steps done. And we're going to break down each of these components shortly. So when we talk about the goals are your overarching, what you're hoping to achieve with your entire communication plan. So some potential types of goals include validating why you're using the programs you are, why you're implementing this particular tool, how things are working, why continued evaluation is important, why continued investment in collecting data is important. So really justifying what you are already doing or hoping to do. Improving what you're currently doing. So improving your programs by identifying gaps or key areas that could use increased attention, improving the steps that you're taking to administer the CCYS so that you could maybe have a broader reach, get more students to participate, etc. To educate, so educating the community, educating key stakeholders about things like ATOD or dynamics in your community, about the student survey, about how they can use the data from the survey. Motivating key stakeholders to take action. This can be motivating your coalition members to get out and share the messages of the coalition, motivating teachers, motivating law enforcement or funders, really leveraging funds, getting people to invest their time, energy, or resources in what you're doing. And then finally, one of your overarching goals could be to create change. So creating positive social or policy change, changing policy, big P or little p, school policies, community policies, state policies. So at a full range of different types of change that you might be motivating. And as I mentioned, it's really important that when you think about your communication plan, you ground it in who your audience is. So knowing your audience, what they care about, what motivates them, what they're likely to want to hear more about or take action towards. And then once you've identified your key audiences, thinking about how much detail they want and need. Oftentimes you have experience working with these stakeholders, so you may already have a good sense of that. In a moment, we're going to share some common audiences and the level of detail that we have found that they tend to want and need. How much do you think they already know about a topic? Do you need to fill them in on background about what the youth survey is, why it's conducted, what types of questions it includes? Or do they already have that background, and what they need to know is more about how it's going to be done and why it's important? And then how do they prefer to be reached? What types of methods are most likely to get their attention? Are they most likely to encounter, such as social media or formal reports or presentations at community events? And again, really meeting people where they are, making sure that you understand how to best reach them in a way that's comfortable and accessible for them, especially if you're going to be asking them to do something with the information that you're sharing. So as I mentioned, there are a couple of key audiences that we commonly are developing communication plans for. And here's what we've learned about what they often want. And again, it may look different in your community. So this is just an example. But generally, when we're talking to community members, they really appreciate information being short, concise. They like to have a broad scope, a broad understanding of what's going on. They don't necessarily feel the need to dig into a specific topic area right out of the gate. So kind of a snapshot at the 30,000 foot level. On the other hand, when we talk to policymakers, often what they want is something, again, that's brief, but really impact focused and topic specific. So digging deeper on a specific area that they might be able to enact change in. And they want select details that can help support the perspective that you're hoping that they carry forward. So some key data points that they can then leverage or use when they're making a case for a policy change. For program staff, on the other hand, we tend to see that they like to have some key points and supporting details, and really information that's focused on their specific role or work, the type of program that they're doing, the type of population that they're serving, the ways that they can use information to leverage those additional resources. And then for funders, that's the group that tends to really want it all. They want to have the high level of detail, a comprehensive overview of everything that they're funding, what those outcomes are, all of the detail about went into how you collected the data, how many schools participated, how many students participated, what's the breakdown of the students that participated, how well do they reflect the overall student population. So really digging into a high level of detail for funders. So then as we're moving through our communication plan components, we get into messaging. And as I mentioned before, it's really important to ground your messaging in what your audience already knows and needs to know, what will motivate them. I missed it on the previous slide, but I do want to point out that there is a data accuracy handout that goes along with this slide. And that has a little bit more detail in making sure that what you're providing accurately reflects the data that you have in mind. Again, we know that you've worked with data a lot, so none of that information is probably a surprise, but it's a good reminder, and it's also something that can be really helpful to share with other coalition members or youth or anybody else that's helping you carry your messaging forward to make sure that they're also delivering accurate messages. So when we think about key messages, it's important that those key messages are clear, that you're upfront about what the limitations are, that you're upfront about who participated, whether they do represent the overall student population, who is this information reflecting, who is it missing? Making sure that your messaging is consistent. So if you're saying in one place that a particular issue is a problem, for instance, underage alcohol use, it's important that you consistently deliver that message. It may be mixed with a message of underage alcohol use is a problem, but we've made some progress in addressing it. But you still want to be consistent in framing up what that key message is. It's helpful to focus on your key takeaways. So what do you want somebody to do with this information? What's the next step for them? Keeping it actionable. So make sure that they know how to carry that next step forward. What are some resources that they might need to tap into? What resources can you provide to support that work? And then provide important context. Again, things like why this particular data point matters, who it includes, who it's about, and who it's important to. Some additional things that we want you to think about when we talk about messaging is that we also want you to be really thoughtful about what makes a key finding. So there are some things that we often take into account, such as patterns or themes. Are there ideas that are popping up throughout your data? For instance, are you seeing that there's a theme where maybe males in your schools are taking more risks than females? Or is there a pattern where you are seeing some trends of substance use going down over time across multiple substances? And it seems like there's some important messaging that could happen there. Are there findings that are surprising, things that are unexpected or not what you have seen in the past? Those might be worth noting and bringing forward. Are there some interesting stories? Are there things that you're seeing that clearly reflect some anecdotal information or other data sources in your community? Do you have some qualitative information that you compare with your student survey data? And then again, making sure recommendations are actionable. And one important note about this, especially when we're talking about actionable results, is that we really want to be clear when we're talking about data on disparities, that we're providing additional context about the systems and structures that can cause those disparities. So when sharing the data without context, you risk reinforcing some common stereotypes and narratives that then perpetuate those disparities, especially the narrative that disparities are caused by individual behavior or are linked to a specific group. So it's really important that you think about the broader systemic factors that might be playing into why a disparity exists. And when you're thinking about actually putting these key messages out into the community and thinking about how you're going to disseminate them, it's important to make sure that your data products are visually interesting. So make sure that you have enough white space, you don't overcrowd your pages, use visuals, you can use bullet points, sidebars, charts, tables. You can mix it up. So use narrative, tables, charts, figures, quotes, themes, infographics, little images. Throughout your entire presentation, you can use different ways of sharing information. Use straightforward language, so avoid jargon and avoid acronyms unless you've clearly spelled them out. Keep sentences and paragraphs short, use active voice, make sure that everything that you're saying is clear, and it helps to have an outside reader, somebody that's not as familiar with your data source or with your topic, review what you've put together and make sure that it's clear to them, because you don't necessarily know how much information the end user is going to have. Be specific, so who do the data represent? Who is included in the report? What did they actually report? Try to the best of your ability to mirror the language in a survey question or the response options when you're sharing the results back to make it very, very clear exactly what people were responding to. For instance, when you're reporting, you may want to be clear that it's 9th through 12th graders versus students in general, or any past use in the last 30 days versus alcohol use in general. Or when we talk about the common questions about perceived risk of harm, making sure that you're clear about whether you're talking about great risk of harm or great and moderate risk of harm. And again, being really, really upfront about exactly what you are and are not including. And then be objective. So there's a link at the bottom of this page to a more comprehensive guide for reporting research findings, including all of these points, in addition to some other considerations when it comes to reporting quantitative versus qualitative research findings and ways to frame those different findings. So avoid pairing emotionally charged language with your data. So while we do want to make sure that our data are actionable it's important that we include the data as it stands, and data by itself doesn't have meaning. We are the ones that attach the meaning to the data. So make sure that you're clear about what the data is, and then make sure that you clearly identify what your interpretation of the data is. You can turn disappointing findings into recommendations or opportunities for improvement. And that can be really helpful for keeping and maintaining community buy-in. Sometimes people, when they see negative results or results that they didn't expect, can shut down or question the accuracy of the data. And as long as you're confident in the data that you're sharing, it's really helpful to sometimes take those findings and, again, focus on what could change about them. Where's the hope there? And then be clear about data limitations. For instance, if a certain population was overrepresented in the data or underrepresented in the data, if a lot of students skipped a question, or if the way that the question was asked was potentially confusing to students, and that makes it harder to interpret the results, be upfront about that. So when we're thinking about specific delivery methods, I know that you guys talked about some in our last webinar, such as a 30-second video. I thought that was really helpful. You talked, I think, specifically about youth being involved in that, which is wonderful. That's the ideal. So when we talk about different delivery methods, we like to use this food metaphor. So we talk about it in terms of a taste, a snack, and a meal. And so a taste is sharing really one data point to whet their appetite, get them kind of excited about data, but not overwhelm them. So this is kind of, like a taster at the supermarket. It's their way to get you to know that a product is good without, you indulging in the whole thing or having to buy it. So an example of this could be, a radio PSA that's really brief, putting one data point on a scratch off, or the fortune teller thing, or the fortune cookie that you talked about last time. Share one data point paired with a visual or graphic, and pair it with a larger piece about what you're doing in the community or what you want your audience to do. We do something similar to that here in Minnesota, and we call it What's the Data Point? And so I think Melissa might have shared that during the last webinar. But generally, we just include one specific data point, and then the rest of the little email or newsletter article is really about what the audience can do or what the state is doing around that data point. And then again, bonus points if you include youth in disseminating, creating, starring in any of these tastes. Then once you've kind of whet their appetite, gotten them excited, you can move into a snack. So a snack includes things like an infographic or a fact sheet or a brief. So it's a little more than a taste. It does tell a little bit more of a story, but it's very concise and topic specific. And it uses a combination of numbers, words, images. It can lead your reader to the point that you want them to walk away with. And it helps if you use a hook. So maybe something that is surprising or is really motivating right up front, and then create a cohesive story around it, including that call to action. And then finally, for those that are really hungry for more and they want as much information as you can share, you have your meal. And so it's important to keep audiences engaged in the meal. So I know that sometimes when we deliver data meals, they can get a little bit dry and a little bit dense, but it's helpful to really try to spice them up. So I'm really driving home this food metaphor. And so clearly I'm still hungry from lunch. So this can include things like a full report, a longer 1-hour presentation, or a data party like we talked about last time. And again, avoid using long, dense paragraphs. You can still be visual even in a full report. You can still provide interactivity even in a presentation. So there are still ways to integrate some of those approaches that we talked about with the taste and the snack into the full meal, that you're still providing the more comprehensive information and balancing it with something that's really engaging. So we have a couple of examples here of deliverables that we've used for other projects. And this first one is really looking at materials for the front end of the project. So when you're motivating somebody to take the CCYS. So in this example, this was a client that I've worked with for several years now, and they do a community-wide survey in 3 different areas in Massachusetts and New York. And so we wanted to, and it's the community-wide survey is for a very, very specific population. It's for families of youth with intellectual disabilities or learning disabilities. So it's not necessarily a population where you can just go find people on the street and get them to take a survey. So we really needed to do a lot to get partners motivated to help us recruit and to get families excited to want to participate. So we created this suite of materials, and you have access to it. It's handout number 5, but I want to point out a couple of things about it. So first of all, is that these materials include some background information about the study and why we're doing it. It includes that ask of our study partners. So we want them to help us reach families. We want them to be motivated to gather this information because we believe it can benefit them. It includes some sample messages that they can share via newspapers, newsletters, text or Twitter, and then also population-specific newsletters or Facebook groups that they might have access to. It includes a frequently asked question document that they can use to respond to questions from families who might be interested in participating. And then it includes 2 types of flyers. So one type they can hang up and it has some tear-off slips that families can take with them. And another type they can just distribute to families. Like if they are seeing families for appointments, they can hand it to a family to take with them. So we created this whole suite of materials to make it as easy as possible for our partners to help us administer this survey. And certainly you could do something similar for the CCYS. And last time we shared an example of a frequently asked questions document that we created for our student survey. And you could integrate some of that information into a suite of materials like this. Another example that I wanted to share is on the back end. So after you have your data, what you might do with it in order to share it with your community. So in this case, we wanted to share information about poverty and substance use. So in order to provide that background context, it was really important that we identified the number of youth in poverty, so that grounding context. It was also important to be very clear about how poverty is measured in our survey, what it does and doesn't include. And then the why does it matter to this audience? So creating that clear, explicit link between poverty and ATOD use. And then finally, the actionable result. So protective factor data, what can they actually change in their community? They may not be able to change poverty in their community. However, they can make sure that youth feel like that adults in their community care about them. So that's very actionable. And so this is an example of how we can put all of those elements together into one single deliverable to share with different members of the community. Melissa, I'm going to transition over to you now.
Thanks, Kristen. So I wanted to dig in a little bit more into some of the elements of the communication plan that Kristen shared at the beginning of the webinar. And the first one is timeline. So we've been talking about both before the survey happens and after the survey is completed. So one thing to think about if you're working on a communication plan for promoting participation in and building buy-in for actually taking the survey, it's important to work backwards from the survey implementation date. So working backwards, when does school administration need to actually sign up and register for the survey so that they get the survey links and survey materials and packets in time? Then stepping forward of that, if your school administration is on the fence or leaning towards not taking the survey, when would you need to get the ear of some local community stakeholders and champions who might be able to sway that school administration? Conversely, if you're thinking about a timeline for sharing out survey findings after the survey has been administered, thinking about key dates. So for example, if you're hoping to work with a local school district to use their findings to improve their policies, or perhaps identify a prevention curriculum that you'd like them to implement, when do they need to make those key decisions in order to get a policy change in place before the next school year starts? Or when do they have to decide about what curriculum they're going to teach? And is there a component that requires getting school staff trained on that first? Also, when thinking about sharing data with a broader audience, maybe putting together a calendar, a timeline. For example, do you want to share data from your CCYS on mental health to align with Mental Health Awareness Month? So just making sure you're thinking about when you want to share it, and then when you need to start working with your graphic designers and your team on those infographics and reports so that you can have it ready. Making sure that we're keeping our messaging fresh and timely. So again, when you're thinking about building buy-in and support for participation in the survey, making sure that you're reaching them at those key decision points, not too late that it's too late for them to actually participate in the survey, but not too soon that they lose motivation and steam, or that you're catching them at the tail end of a school year when they're burnt out and just ready for a little summer. But then also after the survey has been complete and you're getting messaging out, this is where it can be really helpful to share information in tastes and snacks, so that you're sharing it on a regular basis and not just putting out one report and then washing your hands and saying we're done with sharing the data. And then also think about the order of audiences in which you want to share. And again, this is really key, both in thinking about a communication plan before the survey and a communication plan after the survey. So again, going back to that example, if your school administration is maybe leaning towards not taking the survey, do you maybe have to get the ear of a key community stakeholder who is going to have some sway? Or if the school administration is super on board with the survey, but they're getting pushback from parents who are concerned about some of the questions on the survey, maybe you start with the school administration and work with them to come up with a communication plan to help share the importance of having that data with families and parents who might be concerned. Similarly, when you're finding data after the survey has been complete, is there a specific order of audiences? You might want to start with having those conversations with a school board, especially in cases like Kristen shared, where you might have some negative data. Maybe they're not ready to share their data on bullying with the broader community. Maybe they first want to have time to come up with a plan for how they're going to address it before they make that data available. And that can be really helpful politically to have that trusting relationship with your school when you're sharing data that might reflect negatively on them. Also consider order of audiences. I really love bringing youth survey data back to youth to help make meaning out of it. And that can be helpful, that meaning making, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, before you actually start on the communication plan. And so the one thing that we want to stress too is communication planning doesn't need to require a whole string of different tools or anything complicated. One simple tool can do it all. It's like a pocket utility knife. It's more about the content of the plan and what's in it. So for example, some of my drug-free community clients get irritated with me when I say, hey, let's come up with a communication plan for this. You can use this template to come up with a plan for how you're going to raise awareness of your coalition, what its mission is, and what activities it's implementing. You can use this plan again for a separate communication plan to share your CCYS data out with community members. You could use this communication plan again after you've been implementing prevention strategies for a number of years and you've started to see some successes, which might include a combination of reductions in rates of substance use from your CCYS data paired with some other evaluation data, maybe some qualitative data from youth focus groups, to share some of those successes and how your coalition has achieved change over time. So again, it's more about the meat of the plan and what you put in it. And then one thing I like to stress too is I sometimes get eye rolls from my clients because this feels like a really formal sit down and do some planning and they're ready to get acting. But I've also seen cases where, they maybe leave communications to a summer intern who hasn't been at the table for very long and doesn't have the whole context. And so, oh, this is a young person and they know social media, so we'll just let them put out messaging. It can really help to make sure that all of your stakeholders, all of your coalition members are on board about what messages you want to share and what context that you want to provide so that it's all in writing. So going back to that example of putting together a communication plan before a survey, this is really in general to motivate individuals to participate in the survey. And so this is going to be really targeted to those schools that might be reluctant or on the fence about participation, maybe to new stakeholders who are new to the community or are less familiar with the CCYS. Or again, in that example, maybe it's not the schools that are reluctant, maybe it's the broader community. So figuring out really targeted, who do you need to convince in order to get them to take the survey? And then also making sure that you're building excitement about the survey. And we covered a lot of that in the first webinar, which was recorded. So talking about successes and how you've used the data, talking about why it's important, and then also using data from previous iterations of the survey to show successes and change over time. And then also thinking about sharing multiple perspectives, thinking about who relies on the survey data, who looks forward to the changes in policies and programs that come as a result of using that data. So I noted before here in Minnesota, as we're gearing up for our statewide youth survey, we're putting together a webinar series that is going to have panelists who are teachers, youth counselors, youth serving org directors. So getting multiple perspectives and voices about why it's important. So an example of what this might look like in the communication plan template, which you have in handout 1, an audience for this communication plan could be school administration, as we've talked about. The key message you might want to share to motivate them would be maybe a data point on one local data point from a previous survey, and then how you've moved the needle on that through prevention strategies. The delivery method for school administration, it might be ideal to sit down and meet with them face-to-face so that you can be ready to address any of their concerns with your talking points, but then also having a one-page document that you can hand to them that has some talking points and data on it. So a snack where you can verbally back it up, but then also leave them with something in their hands that they can look at later. Who would be responsible for this? Maybe identifying a couple of local survey champions who can both communicate with that school administration, each from a unique perspective and each sharing the different ways that they rely on the data. And timing, locally, you're going to want to get into the nuts and bolts of saying, we want to do this by January 15th of 2022. But for the purposes of this general conversation, just thinking about, again, like working backwards from when the survey would be implemented. Then thinking about after the youth survey, it's important to share the data with key stakeholders to help them make meaning out of the data. And this is a bit unique to when you're coming up with your data products and the messages and key takeaways you want to share. This is a step that maybe comes before you put together your communication plan to figure out what's meaningful to the stakeholders that are involved. So again, you might take a look at some data and come away with some conclusions of what you think people should do, but maybe the youth who took the survey have a unique perspective. And this is where I think it can be really helpful to pair different data collection methods. So bringing the youth survey data back to the youth themselves and say, hey, we're noticing that there was an increase in the percentage of students reporting marijuana use. Do you know what's behind this? Do you know what's going on? Do you have a sense of what's driving this? And then that can help provide a little bit more context rather than moving forward with creating a data product and a message that you want people to take away with without learning about what's meaningful to others in the community. And that really makes sure that you build that buy-in and support for your messages. And then just in terms of making sure that you're sharing findings broadly and repeatedly. And this is where it can help too, to think about that order of audiences. Again, maybe you want to sit down and make meaning out of the data with the youth who participated and with the school board before you then take the findings to a community leader. And just making sure that you're using the information often. And I really love this graphic. You can have the data just sitting there, and if it's not being shared, discussed, and acted upon, it's just some raw ingredients. And I also love the presentation piece of it, because, and it goes back to the snack metaphor. If you hand somebody a pile of cake without any of the bells and whistles and frosting, they might not want to consume it. They might not want to eat it. And so making it really engaging and eye-catching, as Kristen was talking about, will help them consume it and then use that knowledge to make change and act. And that's one of the most important things that we can do, is actually use the finding, because it honors the time of our students who are taking the survey and honors the time of the school staff who take the time out to administer it. And this is also where a communication plan can come in handy. So if your coalition sits down and decides that you want to add a curriculum to the school on vaping risks, if you're not telling parents and the broader community that you did that, they're not going to know that you're actually acting on the survey data. So I think it's also important to use a communication plan to say, hey, this is what we're doing because of what we saw in the data. And so an example of what that communication plan might look like after the survey would be figuring out what you want to share with the general community from the results. And that might be an increase in youth vaping. And again, as Kristen shared, we wouldn't want to necessarily say that's alarming or shocking, adding value, but just really sharing, this is what we saw as an increase. Are you concerned about it? What do you think we should do about it? And this is where, with the community members who want something really concise, high level and engaging, a youth created video would be really a great way to get to the minds and hearts of parents and community members. And just thinking about timing, is that something that you would want to do before the end of the school year, when youth are back out in their neighborhoods and homes and maybe have greater access to vaping products? Brave souls out there in the group, throw out one audience member that you would reach when you're trying to work to promote buy-in for and participation in the CCYS, and maybe throw out an audience other than school administration just to mix it up, since that was in the sample example.
The sheriff departments, police departments, your town hall, the mayor's office. It's always good to work with your mayor.
Or your government body.
We found this year that our local governing entity board members, they assisted us in getting us buy-in for CCYS.
What about your faith-based community? Officers?
How about we move over to key messages? What would be a key message for the sheriff's department or law enforcement? One takeaway that you would want them to know.
Drug use.
And the importance of participating in the survey so that you have data on drug use.
So that you have data and that you can provide funding opportunity, you have the funding opportunities to provide resources to the community.
Mm-hmm. How about the mayor's office? Would that be a similar key message or something different?
I would want data on availability or accessibility.
I would think a mayor would want to know would want to have kind of a snapshot of what his community and what's going on in the community at that point in time.
How about for a government body? Would that look similar?
Yes, I think it'd be very similar to a local governing body.
And somebody shared that they worked with their local board to build buy-in for the CCYS. What were the key messages shared with them?
We talked about some of the data and how important that data is, so we know how we can allocate funds, not only as a board, but also how important that data is, so we know what's going on in the community and what areas we need to address. But we also talked about getting, it's important when you're applying for grants, and that most of the grants are data driven, and that if we don't have this data, then we don't get monies to address the problems in this area.
Exactly. And how about the faith-based community?
I think the data is good for faith-based. They're constantly working with the youth population and trying to address their needs.
Are there specific needs that they're most interested in?
Well, I think in terms of, you know, some of the risk and protective factors shows the importance of what they can be doing, you know, what their role can be.
Yeah, I know sometimes in our communities, the faith-based partners don't necessarily want to talk about alcohol and drugs, but they are really concerned about some of those protective factors that they can boost. All right, so in terms of getting these key messages to each audience, what would be the best approach for sharing information with a sheriff? How do they want to get their information?
You can always, sheriffs and all are, you know, always on the go, as most people are. So, you know, if you've got just a straight single sheet of paper that's got all your highlight points that they need, boom, boom, boom.
Mm-hmm.
There are a number of items in the caring communities that care youth CCYS model that address things that are illegal that students are engaged in or at risk from, including you know, the sale of illegal substances, the driving while intoxicated, or driving with someone who is intoxicated or has used alcohol, and a few other factors that aren't coming to mind right now. But those are things that I would, you know, and I try to make the point. Well, you know, if 4% of the kids have sold drugs in the last last year, which is, it's like a minimum number. I think at one point it was 6% or something or other, but it bounces around a little bit. But you know, that's a felony, you know, likely a felony. And what do we, you know, that's unacceptable. You know, that from their point of view, I mean, this is, how do we prevent that? So it's about prevention of crimes committed by our children.
And Nicole noted in the chat that law enforcement are often busy and on the go. And so sometimes sharing some data with them or facts through you know, a social media, a text. I know in our communities, a lot of times texts are sent out to the law enforcement to, you know, hey, it's important that you come to this meeting, and here's a data point to say why. That's a good example. And maybe moving across the grid, who would be the best person to share that message with the sheriff? Who has that person's ear?
You can do that a couple of ways. Usually, you know, if you run a program directors or whoever, someone that they would work with fairly consistency, you know, they've got that relationship built. But what always works well is if you do have a youth coalition, you can take one of your lead youth members to actually share that information. And that works very well.
What about, I know we're jumping around, but I just want to be cognizant of time for local board members. How were the importance of data shared with them, or how could that be shared?
You can always do a town hall style presentation. Set up a little video, go through highlight points, maybe take 10, 15-minute presentation.
Perfect.
That might be, doing an original video might be a problem in terms of the resources, but perhaps there are videos, general videos available, and then you can provide your own data building off of the generalized video.
That's a fabulous idea, of having a standardized video that stresses the importance of having data, and then throwing in your customization by sharing local data to pair. It's great. And is there a person who would be in a particularly compelling role to sway the local board members? And I might pair that question with thinking about timing. So sometimes it's helpful to, for example, deliver key messages to the mayor's office, and then ask the mayor to meet with local board members. Are there thoughts about, just in terms of looking across sheriff, mayors, government board, local board, and faith community, is there one in particular that you would want to share messages with first to build buy-in? And a shout out to Summer. Sounds like they took the COVID shutdown as an opportunity to make a video about the importance of CCYS. Thank you for sharing that example. Right, and it sounds like somebody else thought that maybe, in addition to maybe having the mayor, having a champion parent. I think that parents can be great champions, just as a lead youth from a youth group could be. All right. Well, I was hoping we'd get through more of a plan, but I thank you all for sharing these ideas. Those are great examples of just how to sit down and think through how you can use one single tool with one single goal of promoting the survey, and then breaking it down by audience and what's going to be most important to them. So we will share back all of the answers to the Jeopardy questions with you. I thank you for taking the time in your small groups to think through what those answers might be, but we'll make sure that we get those to you. And then also we'll kind of clean up the communication plan that we started and share that back with you as well. So Bev, I'll hand it back over to you.
Okay, all right. Thank you to our presenters. Does anyone have any questions for the presenters? And if you can share the screen, there we go. Any questions at all or comments? Okay, this is a way to connect with us. Feel free to connect with us in any of these different ways. We are on Twitter now, so feel free to join us there. And here is our feedback. link. Feel free to fill out the event survey. Your feedback is very important to us. And Elizabeth will be placing the evaluation link in the chat. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me, and my information is there. We appreciate your time, and we do apologize for the technical difficulties.